All right, welcome back to an unconventional edition of Anna Reads. We are back with chapter 13 of Unmentionable, the Victorian Lady's Guide to Sex, Marriage, and Manners by Therese O'Neill. You'll notice I am not on my front porch, nor am I at the local elementary school. This is Burnt Park in downtown Macon, and I just needed a change of scenery before I went out of my mind. On that note, chapter 13, we have It's Hysterical, the least funny thing about Victorian life. Bad news, my fragile flower. This has been a rough trip, and I'm beginning to suspect that you may be suffering from the very serious affliction of hysteria. That is to say, it appears your uterus is diseased. Not in any way that we can measure, test for, or even see should we perform one of the increasingly popular hysterectomies to relieve you of it, but the sickness is there all the same, and it is causing you to display embarrassing signs of instability. What signs, you ask? A touch of indignation in your voice? You say you're pretty sure you've just got the usual combination of menstrual cramps and a headache? Are you getting lippy with me, Miss Missy? Patient indicates uterine convulsions, cranial derangement, and has been observed displaying impertinent irritability. Tisk, tisk, diagnosis confirmed, hysteria. Page 261, heading, Medicinal Orgasms and Other Fictions. So many of the things we've explored in your host century may have caused you to hide a very 21st century smirk behind your gloved hand, for they were very silly and strange. But we cannot so easily find pleasure in the oddity that was hysteria. That will not stop us from trying. There's a bug. Hysteria was not, as you might have been told, a made-up prognosis that sexually frustrated women claimed to have in order to receive medically induced orgasms from handsome doctors. Oh, I'm sure that happened from time to time. All through history back to Hippocrates, it was suggested that to clear ovarian congestion, a midwife should oil her fingers and manipulate the vulva toward a medicinal orgasm for her patient. And when you add that the 19th century is the historical epoch of quackery, you're bound to find a doctor willing to perform that technique on you. You could also find a doctor to feed you abortion-inducing poisons and cure your ovarian cancer by dunking you in a large pot of Epsom salts and gin. That didn't mean it was generally accepted practice. Remember, Victorian doctors weren't actually stupid. I could debate that. They were just poorly informed while refusing to even suspect that they were poorly informed. At any rate, they didn't think women were incapable of sexual arousal or orgasm. They knew women had orgasms, and they even approved of them, provided they issued from Holy Marital Congress. A wife should be healthfully sexed if she is to please her husband and produce broods of fat-legged babies. Those doctors just had no idea how women orgasmed. Bless them, they took it for granted that sexual satisfaction in a lady was accomplished the same way it was in a gentleman, which was insert male member in specially designed holster, agitate to and fro, repeat, bestow upon the female organs the gift of life-giving fluid, and thus share coital bliss. They knew clitoral stimulation resulted in arousal, but that arousal was immature and base, resulting in a puny imitation of the pleasure a woman could receive only when the love pollen of her husband had enticed the flower of her cervix to full bloom. 236, heading, Epilepsy, Cancer, or maybe you're just bored. So let's forget everything we think we know about sex-starved socialites. They have a place in this era, but very little in this chapter. First, I would like to tell you what hysteria actually was, which is incredibly difficult, because the only honest definition I can give you is a misdiagnosis. epilepsy, diabetic shock, neural disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, postpartum depression, and bipolar disorders do not necessarily cause similar symptoms, but they were all commonly diagnosed as hysteria. Anything, if it happened to a sullen woman, could be hysteria. In fairness, the only disease in the above list firmly footed in medical minds of the day was epilepsy, and doctors often wrote of the trouble telling the two apart. In women, however, secondary symptoms such as showing feelings would often help the doctor diagnose her muscular seizures and unconscious convulsions as a byproduct of a temperamental uterus, or ovaries, spinal nerves, brain sheaths, psyche. Have your bowels been regular? This is the other reason it is so difficult to tell you what hysteria was. The physical source of the hysterical tendency changed with nearly every doctor and decade of this century. Hysteria reminds us just how crooked and long the journey to viable treatment for mental illness has been. It is a very recent thing that mental illness has a spectrum or gradient. In 1850, you were a damned lunatic or you weren't. You didn't vent your insecurities to a talk therapist. You didn't take pills to keep your brain from being so stingy with its serotonin drippings. You didn't even call your mother and moan to her, for she did not raise you to be a blubbering ninny. No. You usually had two options. By far the most popular was quit your belly aching and get back to the arduous and unrewarding work of being alive. People who chose this route often also took on the responsibility of self-medication, usually with whiskey or opiates, depending on your income. Or you went mad, screaming on the street corner crazy. No gradients. But women, dear heart, we are the weaker vessels. We cannot be expected to mentally bear as much as the stronger sex. Therefore, the unspoken historical law, known henceforth as the Quit Ya Bitchin' Act, held a loophole for the female accused. It was called hysteria. 265, heading, the ladylike version of crazy. In the 1800s, you couldn't just duck out of life for a week as you might in the 21st century. There's a beautiful Weimaraner over there, but I'm trying not to distract him. If you were not extremely wealthy, your presence was required for the survival of your family. You couldn't declare it frozen pizza night and go to bed at 7. Rather, your family would not eat at all if you did not begin laboring for them at sunrise and continue until you dropped exhausted into your bed that night, at which point you would be obliged to roll onto your back and graciously invite your husband to place one more needy dependent at your teat and table. And if you were wealthy, you had a different kind of pressure, one of appearances and social duties. These were non-optional. In The Big Bang Theory, we have Sheldon Cooper and his non-optional social conventions. Well, these are even less optional, even more non-optional. What have you? Sometimes it got to be too much. Sometimes you had to rest. And since rest was for the weak, you had to become weak. You had to become very sick. Hysteria was the perfect kind of lunacy. It left no permanent stain. You could be cured of hysteria after procuring yourself a nice long rest away from the drudgery of your life. Or, if wealth and position meant your life was simply excruciatingly boring and pointless, you were now involved in the most excitement you'd ever had. Everyone fussing over you, paying attention to your every sigh and twitch. What a far cry from being ignored except for when curtly reminded that proper young ladies do not build towers out of soup bowls at the dinner table. Hysteria was more common among the young and wealthy. They weren't overworked, but their lives were a sort of pointless drudgery too, unless they really got off on tatting doilies. And it's here I'd like to bring your attention to the plot of Brave by Disney Pixar. Merida has every reason to be as crabby as she is. There is at least a decade between her and her young brothers, so for the first however long of her life, she was basically a prince. She was the sole crown heir with all the rights and autonomy thereof. As soon as it became clear her brothers were going to survive to maturity, she was downgraded to walking uterus. I think I'd be crabby enough to turn my mom into a bear as well if I got downgraded from prince to walking uterus. Just saying. 266, heading. Things you can tell just by looking at her urine. I am not making this up. If the hysteria diagnoses did not fall into the clearly mistaken physical illness, many of the physical symptoms of hysteria weren't quantifiable, meaning you pretty much had to take a lady's word for it if she said she couldn't feel her toes. Even pressing a pin into the affected area to see if sensation was truly dead only required the woman to not express pain, something anyone who's had a booster shot knows is possible. So when doctors attempted to describe the disease, the result was either a recitation from a dictionary of every conceivable discomfort or a tirade that read like a headmaster's chastising letter home to parents. Let us look at some of the top medical opinions on the definition of this disease. According to Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, block quote, the patient laughs or cries immoderately without cause. Parenthetically, we now know that pseudobulbar affect is a thing. Has hallucinations, sensitive to light and sound, breasts sensitive, pain in ovary, headache, wandering pains in the chest, abdomen, joints, and spine, especially between the shoulders. Oh Lord, where are we? Loss of sensation in the skin, paralysis of certain muscles, sometimes loss of voice, sensation as of a ball rising in the throat, contraction of the muscles, violent spasms, disorder of digestion with symptoms of nervous dyspepsia, changeable temper, sometimes large quantity of pale urine, in some cases delirium or stupor. According to Edward Cox Mann, who wrote 1883's A Manual of Psychological Medicine and Allied Nervous Diseases, block quote, the mental condition of a woman affected with hysteria is somewhat peculiar. The patient, when the hysterical feelings come upon her, does not feel disposed to make the slightest effort to resist them and yields to her emotions, whatever they may be. She cares nothing for her duties and seemingly takes pleasure in exaggerating all her slight discomforts and annoyances. She indignantly resents all attempts and efforts for her comfort and cure, and discards all advice from her best friends, but will eagerly listen to the counsel of the many friends who come in to pity, sympathize, and condole with her. Why, that sounds just like girls whining on Facebook, doesn't it? According to Dr. Pi Henry Shavasa, we haven't heard the last of this dude. Block quote, now, hysteria causes a wretched train of symptoms, mimicking almost every disease that flesh is heir to. Menstruation in nearly all cases of hysteria is more or less at fault. It is either too profuse, too deficient, absent altogether, so that, in point of fact, hysteria and malmenstruation generally go hand in hand together. I've tried going hand in hand apart. It's very painful. As for the poor malmenstruating lady, Shavas says, block quote, flatulence is sometimes the torment of her life. It not only causes much discomfort, but frequently great pain. The wind wobbles about the bowels outrageously, first in one place, then in another, then rising in volumes to her throat, almost choking her the while. Motorcycle going by. There is another peculiarity of hysteria, which is very characteristic of the complaint. Namely, a hysterical patient is afraid to go either to church or to any other place of worship. If she should venture there, she feels as if she should be smothered or suffocated, or as though the roof were going to fall upon her, and at the sound of the organ she is inclined either to swoon away or scream outright. You know, I get the same sensation stepping foot into a Catholic church, but I have my own reasons for that. not the least of which is my dad was a lifelong Catholic, and let's face it, I miss my dad. So, a moody, achy, quiet, cranky, overly emotional, church-dreading, pale pea malmenstruate with gas so intense she actually seems to be choking on it. We know something these men seemingly did not, Sherry. We know that probably every woman who ever existed has had a day or 20 that could be described in those terms. Except for choking on your own internal flatulence, that would be quite an ordeal worthy of medical study. Otherwise, what he's describing is just a lousy hormonal weekend. 269, heading, Faking and Feeding. It's not that these women were faking their misery. They were unhappy, as humans who have the time and leisure to consider their condition often are. The problem was all the circumstances that were feeding that unhappiness. The mind can wield heavy power over the body, and a woman taught her whole life to believe the words of educated men over her own instincts would have a highly suggestible brain. This is called gaslighting. Women were encouraged toward hysteric behavior by the doctors who treated them and the loved ones who worried for them. A deep sigh becomes a moan, which elicits attention. The moan rises to a shriek. The shriek, to be fair, is long overdue in a culture that punishes human expression, and smashing the pillows with your fists feels awfully right too. Cathartic. All the while the doctor is nodding his head, his suspicions confirmed, and your usually distant mother is wringing her hands in despair over you. One author, George Junkin Preston, who wrote Hysteria and Certain Allied Conditions, Their Nature and Treatment, makes the observation that the more restrained a culture is, the more likely you were to see cases of hysteria, manifested in sudden bursts of emotion, crying, laughing, and hugging strangers. Well, that just sounds like Dragon Con. He suggests hysteria was the mind and body compensating for the lack of emotion permitted in civilized society. You couldn't get any more emotionally restrained than the 19th century while still having access to the romantic novels and sweeping tales of adventure and magazines filled with beautiful lives that it was becoming increasingly apparent you weren't going to have. Dr. Mann gives a harsh but likely portrayal of the emotional hysteric. Block quote, "We must endeavor to remove the mental or emotional cause of the disease. The class of patients whom we see are women who, from their social position and surroundings, have really no object in life but to amuse themselves. They have, as a rule, been spoiled and petted since childhood, and as their nervous system is developed far in excess of their physique, they become, as they grow up, capricious and hysterical." People are still complaining about this today. If you acknowledge that children have emotions, well, then they have emotions, don't they? And that's highly inconvenient. Their imaginary ailments are undoubtedly the cause of much distress to them, for to a person who is highly strung, To a person with highly strung nerves, a slight pain seems a severe pain, and discomfort is magnified into pain. One of my last cases, who had an income of $6,000 and who had nothing to do, and who had consequently become an aggravated case of hysteria, would have been, as a physician who was also a patient with me remarked, a splendid woman if she had to live on $2,500 a year. Of course, you're spoiled. That's your problem. 271, heading, Whom shall we blame? The woman. Don't be stupid. The woman, of course. The chances she is innocent of inciting this condition are quite slim. Even if she's epileptic, it's likely a blight God delivered unto her for some secret vice. The better question is, why have all these women suddenly chosen to become blighted? As the century wound down, there were proportionately fewer cases showing indisputable medical symptoms. Physically ill women were becoming more identifiable as such. and there was an increase in cases of women who complained of various, intense, but completely invisible symptoms. It was almost as if it had become a fashion for women to lose their self-control. What was causing this? Dr. Kellogg believes hysteria stems from dirty thoughts and luxury, and wishes women could partake of all the fine health inherent to Southern slaves. Here we go, block quote. It is a notable fact that hysteria rarely or never occurs among the women of uncivilized nations. It is stated that before the war, the disease was unknown among the Negro women of the South, though it has occasionally been met with since the emancipation. All right, now I'm trying not to shriek. Really? Physicians weren't called to attend slave women who refused to get out of bed or wouldn't stop crying? Of course, physicians were probably not often called to attend slave women who couldn't stop vomiting blood either. Again, we are faced with the possibility that data regarding 19th century minorities might be biased or incomplete. Dr. Chavas pins the blame for the current hysteria on partying too much, 1800s style. Block quote. There is among young wives of the higher ranks an immense deal of hysteria. Can it be wondered at? Certainly not. The fashionable system of spending married life, such as late hours, close rooms, excitement, rounds of visiting, luxurious living, is quite enough to account for its prevalence. The menstrual functions in a case of this kind are not duly performed. She is either too much or too little unwell. The periods occur either too soon or too late, or at irregular periods. A fashionable wife and happy mother are incompatibilities. Oh, it is sad to contemplate the numerous victims that are sacrificed yearly on the shrine of fashion. There you go again, you defiant wretch of a girl, shirking menstrual duties so you can stay awake past 11 p.m. and flit around fashionable parlors. If you entertained half as many people inside your uterus as you do in your drawing room as nature commands, you probably wouldn't be having health issues. There was, of course, one more enormous, unspeakable cause of hysteria, one horrifying enough to require its own chapter, that we may prevent its foulness from contaminating the perfectly innocent subjects that surround it. 274. The cure. Still not sexy doctors or orgasms. You're still very much hoping the cure is some sort of accidental on-purpose masturbation, aren't you? Our modern culture loves that idea. How loathsome. Put your petticoats back on, you devious coquette. The cures you'll be enduring are remarkably less lusty. First of all, most doctors insisted the patient be removed from her home before any treatment could begin. Even then, many doctors sensed that a hysteric condition was egged on by those who indulged it. Says Dr. Preston, block quote, one great reason why the treatment of hysteria is so much more successful in institutions than at home is because in a hospital or sanatorium, absolute obedience to the rules is insisted upon. The daily life of the patient should be arranged for her. For example, it is well to write out a schedule upon which is set down the hour of rising, the time and character of the meals, the periods for rest and exercise, and like details. The establishment of regular habits that are carried out with martial exactness is the first step in the treatment. It is well to inquire minutely into the daily routine of the patient's life and impress her with the importance of the various measures instituted. Strictness, rules. Yet, yes, that's fine. Any high society Victorian knows how to follow rules. But these rules have a real purpose for once. These rules aren't about remembering how long your husband's white cuff should extend from his sleeve to differentiate him from the man who delivers your coal. These rules will change her life. And these rules mean someone is taking care of her. For the first time since she was 14, she's not responsible for all the burdens Victorian womanhood casts upon her. If she's rich, she doesn't have to change clothing 4 times a day and repress every urge that would cause the world to suspect she's flesh and blood, not carved of finest, coldest marble. If she's not rich, oh heavens, she needs a break. She needs to no longer slowly come undone under the weight of so many responsibilities in a brutal world. And with hysteria, all she has to do is eat her mush, take her nap, and get electricity zapped into various parts of her body. No, not the fun parts. Stop that. Still, some cures were quite nice, like the massage technique Preston recommends. Block quote, "Massage should be practiced upon the bare skin. It may be said, in general, that there are the following important movements. 1. Pressing and kneading with the fingertips and knuckles. 2. Tapping with the hand, fist, or some mechanical contrivance. 3. Pinching, which is performed by picking up the muscle bundles that can be grasped." Okay, not too much argument there. He instructs that this begin at the toes and continue on over the whole body except the face. He could be subtly recommending knuckle, tappy, pinchy, nurse-delivered masturbation, but if he is, I'm not sure you're meant to enjoy it. You would, however, probably enjoy an entire body massage, and it would likely help almost anything that ailed you, real or imagined. Kellogg demands that the general health of the patient be first improved through fresh air, exercise, and food conducive to predictable and amicable bowel movements. He is also a fan of water treatments. This primarily meant interrupting a woman's paroxysm, not the orgasmic kind, the screechy wailing kind, by pouring freezing water over her head and down her spine, which I bet worked incredibly well for all versions of hysteria not involving actual brain trauma. Becoming markedly enraged at the thug who would drop a bucket of water on your addled brain would likely eclipse most any other emotion. Given some of the things my sister and I have done to each other, I really can't argue that. Even better, though, was the extremely newfangled use of electricity, says Kellogg. Galvanism to the spine is another useful measure. When there is paralysis of sensation and motion, faradic electricity should be applied to the paralyzed parts. This is classic quack medicine. You can often find these electric doohickeys in certain kinds of flea markets. Electric shocks can make dead frogs dance, you know. They should be more than sufficient to convince a young woman she can feel her feet again. Then the combination of electricity and massage hit the market in the form of, yes, early electric vibrators. They were very popular among doctors who specialized in nervous disorders and quacks who specialized in bored rich ladies. I suggest you go watch the Marx Brothers movie A Day at the Races. At least I think that's the one. Day at the Races, Night at the Opera, they all start to run together. The one with Dr. Quackenbush in it. The real doctors did not advise that the device, called a Faradizer, galvanizer, or simply the hammer, be used on the genitals. Don't use something called the hammer on your private parts. You ought not even need to be told that. Instead, they recommended applying the vibrations directly to the affected area. In the case of hysteria, the region of the abdomen over the ovaries, or more commonly, the spine. Joseph Mortimer Granville marketed one of the first electronic vibrators. In his 1883 medical treatise/instruction manual, Nerve Vibration and Excitation as Agents in the Treatment of Functional Disorder and Organic Disease, states that nerves which cause trouble, such as the ones that induce hysteria in women, are like particularly stupid soldiers. Their electrical pulses are vibrating out of rhythm. It is the job of his electric hammer to be the sergeant who teaches loafing lady nerves to march straight. Block quote, "The manner of operating is to apply the flat-headed hammer if we have to deal with a deeply placed or large nerve sheath. the pointed hammer if the nerve be superficial or small, the hard brush if several nervous filaments lying close together are affected, or the disc if the area of superficial disturbance be very large, and to keep up the percussion until the jerking, twitching, or spasm, reflexly excited by the vibration, subsides. If you have ever seen the 1994 film version of The Secret Garden, this is essentially what Mrs. Medlock and the doctor are trying to do for Colin's legs. They're basically using what would later go on to be the automatic defibrillator. You sent an electrical current through the muscle to try and stop it spasming, and during the tail end of World War II and during the Korean conflict, it was discovered this could stop a heart from fibrillating, leading to more guys coming home in their uniforms than in wooden boxes. So that's kind of neat. This certainly sounds dirty, but he does not ever explicitly say that the percussion should be applied to the genitals. He, like others working medically with electricity, believes there were spots on the spine that corresponded with urogenital organs, and they should be the spots receiving the hammer blows. And in the cases where the doctor thought the uterine tract was congested with whatever miasmas and vapors do so poison a hysterical woman, a variety of vaginal douches, from light warm spritz to the freezing cold fire hose, I'm not joking, was recommended. Are you terribly disappointed we didn't fully examine the masturbation cure? Do you think the method deserves consideration? You are in luck. Victorian men gave masturbation and the women who might employ it a great deal of consideration, and so shall we. Prepare for shame. That has been Lucky Number Chapter 13 of Unmentionable, the Victorian Lady's Guide to Sex, Marriage, and Manners, and this has been Anna Reads. The COVID-19 pandemic is still upon us. We are still being encouraged to practice social distancing. That is why I am in a park that is relatively human-free, and I'm not breathing on anybody. Nobody's breathing on me either. And I would just like to encourage all my viewers, my subscribers, my friends, be extra kind to yourselves and each other, will you? I mean, I'm running around a public park in a Regency-era gown that I made, just for fun. Right now, let's just say some of the rules are suspended, but not the rules of decency. If you must run around in a costume, run around in your costume, but be nice to people while you're doing it, okay? Be extra nice. Love y'all.